Our story begins in the continent of West Africa in a little village called Umoka. There was a skilled barber named Chidi. Chidi was a professional barber who knew how to create the best hairstyles in the entire land. His skills were renowned far and wide. Men traveled from distant lands just to sit in his wooden chair and have their hair shaped by his steady hands. Chidi's barbing salon wasn't the best in town, but despite that, he constantly had customers. People would fight and struggle to sit in his chair just to have their hair cut by Chidi. His skills were spoken of far and wide, and he became very popular. He would always craft the best haircuts, and no one who visited his salon left disappointed. They were all satisfied with his work, and they always paid him extra for his service. But despite his skill and all the recognition he received, he remained a poor barber. He lived in a small hut made of mud walls and thatched roof that stood at the edge of the village near the forest. He had a childhood friend called Ekene. Chidi and Ekene grew up together. They were inseparable as kids, and they shared the best part of their childhood together in the village of Umoka. But at some point, Ekene left the village for the city. Years later, when Ekene returned back to the village, he returned a very wealthy man with lots of money. He had brought with him a big bag full of expensive wrappers for the women in the village and gallons of palm wine for the men. Everyone was happy to see him as he shared money to almost everybody in the village. Chidi had heard that Ekene, his childhood friend, had returned back to the village, but he was too ashamed to meet with him. He didn't want his friend to see his present condition, and so he kept to himself in a small hut throughout the entire duration Ekene was in the village. One day, as Ekene was drinking palm wine with the men of the village in the popular drinking joint, he suddenly remembered Chidi, his childhood friend. He turned to speak to the man sitting close to him to ask him, "Biko, what about Chidi, my childhood friend? I haven't seen him since I arrived in this village. Does he still live here?" To which the man replied, "Of course he does. He is the village barber and a very skilled one at that." Ekene then continued, "But why haven't I seen him till now? Do you have any idea where I can find him?" "That's easy," the man replied. "He stays near the edge of the village in a small hut. I can take you to see him if you want." Ekene then replied, "Yes, please. I would love to see him before I go back to the city." With that, Ekene rose to his feet, paid for the drinks, and also paid for the drinks of everyone seated drinking. This got a collective cheer from the men. They were in a merry mood as there were lots of free drinks to go around. Ekene then signaled to the man and they both left the drinking joint. Meanwhile, Chidi the barber was interested in a beautiful damsel called Amaka. Amaka was very pretty and proud. She loved the finer things of life and constantly wished she would end up with a very rich husband. She was one of the prettiest damsels in the village, if not the prettiest, and she was aware of this. Amaka had only her father. Her mom had died while she was only a child. Amaka's father, popularly referred to as Papa Amaka by the villagers, was a drunkard and a very ill-tempered man. He loved money, but he loved drinking more. There were whispers among the suitors coming for Amaka's hand in marriage. They jokingly said that buying a big gallon of palm wine for Amaka's father was more than enough to get into his good books. Rich and wealthy suitors constantly visited Amaka's father with gifts just to get Amaka's hand in marriage, and Amaka was constantly shunning them. She wanted a life of riches and was only prepared to settle down with the richest and wealthiest of them all. Chidi didn't have the slightest clue how he would woo Amaka. This was because Amaka constantly had the attention of the richer and better looking men in the village. She was the center of attraction. Men bought her expensive gifts, and she was the envy of the other young maidens in the village. One thing was certain: Chidi was madly in love with Amaka, but he lacked the confidence to walk up to her to even talk to her. He constantly thought about her every day, and he vowed to become wealthy so that he would be able to marry her. Back in his little shack of a room, he was trying to sleep on his bed made of straws. Twisting and turning, feeling very uncomfortable, he heard a knock on the door. He quickly sat up on the bed with a surprised look. He rarely had visitors, so he was anxious to see who was knocking. "Who is that?" he said in a concerned tone. "Oh boy, come out, Bikonu," Ekene said, laughing. Chidi instantly recognized Ekene's voice, and he was a bit startled. How did he know my house? Chidi thought. As Chidi opened the door, Ekene smiled and they both hugged each other. Chidi, though reluctantly, invited Ekene into the dimly lit, poorly decorated room. Ekene looked around and felt sorry for his childhood friend Chidi. He could see that his friend was really struggling and living in poverty. "How come I haven't seen you since I arrived back in the village?" Ekene asked. To which Chidi replied, I have been busy," Chidi stammered, for lack of an excuse. They both sat down and recounted old memories. They laughed and cried together as they rolled back the times. When it was time for Ekene to leave, he gave Chidi a big bag full of money. When Chidi opened the bag and saw the money, his eyes widened with shock and surprise. He thanked his friend, and with that, Ekene left for the city. With his small fortune, Chidi used part of the money to upgrade his salon to look a little bit presentable, and used the rest to buy expensive gifts for Amaka, with the aim that at least she would consider him. Within a few weeks, Chidi was back to square one. The money had fizzled out, and he was back where he started. He was tired of living a life of struggle and wanted the life Ekene was living in the city. One day, he decided to visit his friend. Ekene was a wealthy trader who owned several shops and businesses and had numerous workers working for him. He lived in a mansion, and everything around him spelt wealth. When Chidi got to Ekene's home in the city, he was totally blown away by the sheer display of wealth. Ekene lived in a mighty mansion with multiple rooms. He had exotic cars in his garage. There was a security detail who always followed him wherever he went. Chidi was determined to live like his friend Ekene. So one day, while they were sitting down and having a meal, Chidi pleaded with Ekene to assist him to become wealthy. Ekene simply smiled and said, my brother, I want you to do well, but everything you see is not as it seems. There is more that meets the eye." "Forget that one," Chidi replied. "See, I am prepared to do anything. I'm tired of living like this." "Very well," Ekene replied. "Tomorrow, I will take you to see someone. Whatever he directs you to do, ensure you do, and see your situation change for good." Chidi thanked his friend, and they both continued with their meal. The next day, Ekene took Chidi to see an old man in another village. The old man insisted that only Chidi came in to see him. After some time, Chidi emerged from the hut with a determined look. The old man had given Chidi some specific instructions on how he would get wealth. The instructions were tied to his skill as a barber, and the old man assured him that riches and wealth were not far from him, provided he followed all the required steps to the letter. As soon as Chidi got back to the village, he resumed back to his small barber shop and started taking customers. The men had missed his magic touch, and so they thronged to his salon to have their hair cut. The instructions the old man gave Chidi was simple. He was to pack all the hairs of people he had cut for the day in a bag, proceed to a secluded location in the forest where no one could see him, and bury the hairs in the ground while reciting some incantations in the process. This was all he was required to do every night. The old man assured him of riches if he did this without fail. The reason being, whenever anyone who had cut their hair in a salon spent money, the money would automatically appear in his cupboard in his room. Chidi's hands were magic, shaping the hair of men into artful designs that made even the elders nod in approval. Each day, as the sun rose and set over Umoka, Chidi's salon was filled with the laughter of men who had come not only for haircuts, but for the stories that flowed as freely as the river. Chidi himself was quiet, a man of few words, but his work spoke for him. Unknown to the people of Umoka, however, Chidi had a secret that he kept hidden under the layers of his humility. Each night, when the village was asleep and the moon shone bright, Chidi would gather the hairs he had cut during the day, place them in a small leather pouch, and sneak into the depths of the forest. There, beneath the shade of an ancient baobab tree, he would dig a small hole, place the hairs inside, and recite the incantations as directed by the old man. He would bury the hair, sprinkle some sacred powder over the earth, and walk away without looking back. In a very short period, his fortunes changed. He started to wake up to loads and loads of money in his cupboard. He would wake up every morning to the sweet smell of mint notes, and gradually he became very wealthy. What the villagers didn't know was that Chidi's wealth did not come from his barbing skills alone. Every time a man who had sat in Chidi's chair spent money, that money would mysteriously appear in his cupboard by morning. It didn't take long before Chidi became the wealthiest man in the village. He built a large mansion with wide verandas, hired servants, and started trading in the biggest markets. His cattle were the fattest, and his farm was the largest in the entire village. The villagers began to whisper, how could a simple barber become so wealthy so quickly? Men like Uche and Obina, who had once cut their hair at Chidi's salon, noticed that no matter how much money they earned, it seemed to vanish into thin air. He must be favored by the gods, some said. He is definitely hiding something, whispered others. Chidi, for his part, continued his nightly ritual. His wealth grew and grew, and the more money that flowed into his life, the more the villagers watched him with suspicion. He ignored their stares, laughing to himself at their ignorance. Every night, the forest heard his chants, and every morning his cupboard was heavier with gold coins, money, and riches. By now, Amaka had noticed Chidi's sudden change of fortune, and she was curious. She knew Chidi had feelings for her, and seeing Chidi was now the wealthiest man in the village, she began to consider him. Chidi visited Papa Amaka's house with a cart full of expensive gifts and a special box of expensive wine for Amaka's father. Amaka's father had never seen so much expensive gifts in his life. He was overwhelmed by Chidi's newfound wealth and swiftly agreed to Chidi's proposal to marry his daughter. Amaka, on the other hand, was not totally convinced about Chidi's source of wealth. But because she wanted a life of wealth and riches, she agreed to marry Chidi. It was very obvious she was enticed by Chidi's newfound wealth. The wedding was very lavish. No one in the entire Umoka village had ever seen so much wealth on display. Chidi spared no expense in organizing the most elaborate wedding the village of Umoka had ever seen. He showered gifts on Amaka and took good care of her. They eventually got married and had 2 sons. Unfortunately, Chidi began to have extramarital affairs with different women, and this got Amaka very sad and worried. Chidi continued judiciously with his barbing salon despite being a very wealthy man. As part of the ritual, the old man warned Chidi multiple times that no matter how wealthy he got, he was never to leave the barbing job. He was to continue barbing for people and constantly bury the hairs every night. This was the condition required to ensure the ritual was renewed daily. He stuck to the routine unfailingly. Although he had multiple workers and servants, he still stood for hours cutting people's hair. People of the village began to wonder why a wealthy man would waste his time standing for hours just to cut people's hair. One particular day, after Chidi was done for the day, he was very tired. He had been standing for hours because there was a festival the next day and majority of the men had come to have their hair cut. He was supposed to gather the hairs as instructed and proceed to the forest to perform the required daily ritual, but instead, he decided to visit one of his numerous girlfriends to pass the night. As he laid down to sleep, he had a dream. In the dream, he saw the old man who he had met through his friend Dekene. The old man was looking at him and laughing hysterically. This startled him as he woke up, gasping for breath. "What's the meaning of this?" Chidi said to himself, looking worried. Then he remembered that he was supposed to take the hares to the forest the previous day to perform the required ritual as instructed. "Well, it's just only one day," he said. "I believe I will be fine," as he dismissed the dream and the fearful feeling he was experiencing. Chidi had acquired so much wealth but still wanted more. And like they say, greed, like a ravenous beast, is never satisfied. One hot afternoon, a stranger arrived in Umuoka. He was unlike anyone the villagers had ever seen. His skin was dark like the richest soil after the rains. His hair full and thick like the mane of a lion. He wore clothes of fine fabric embroidered with golden thread, and his shoes shone like polished wood. The people of Umuoka marveled at his wealth and grace, but there was something more about him. Chidi, who had been cutting in his salon, watched the stranger approach with great interest. His eyes gleamed at the sight of the man's thick hair, a head full of black coils that cascaded down his neck like a waterfall. "Hello, sir," Chidi called out, masking his greed with a smile. "Welcome to Umuoka. I am Chidi, the finest barber in this land. Sit with me. Let me make you look even more magnificent." The stranger paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as he gazed at Chidi. For a moment, it seemed as though he saw straight through the barber, deep into his heart. But then he smiled, a smile so bright it could have outshone the sun. "Very well," the stranger said. "I will sit in your chair." Chidi's heart raced with excitement. He imagined how much wealth this man's hair would bring him. Surely, someone as rich as this stranger spent money like water. Once he had his hair, Chidi thought, his riches would multiply beyond measure. That night, after cutting the stranger's hair, Chidi hurried to the forest, clutching the thick strands in his pouch. His mind was filled with visions of even greater wealth, a new house, servants to fan him as he ate, and cattle that stretched as far as the eye could see. Under the light of the full moon, he reached the ancient baobab tree. Kneeling, he dug a hole, sprinkled the sacred powder, and began his incantation. "Anyajo, Anyajo, Anyajo." His voice rose, but the wind, which normally howled through the trees in response, was silent. Something was amiss. Undeterred, Chidi buried the hair and stood, wiping his hands clean. He grinned as he turned back towards the village, already imagining the gold that would await him by morning. But when Chidi returned to his house, he froze in terror. The stranger was sitting in his room, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. His presence filled the room with a suffocating aura that made Chidi's knees weak. The cupboard, which should have been overflowing with riches, stood closed and empty. How did you get here?" Chidi stammered, stepping back in shock. The stranger smiled, but it was not the warm smile from earlier, but a smile that sent shivers down Chidi's spine. "Do you think you could steal from me?" the stranger asked, his voice low and menacing. Chidi fell to his knees, trembling. I didn't know. I didn't know who you were. Please forgive me," he cried as his eyes widened with fear and regret. The stranger stood, towering over the now terrified barber. "You did not ask. But now you will know. I am no ordinary man. I am a spirit of the forest sent by the gods to punish the greedy, to punish those who use dark arts for selfish gain. As the spirit spoke, a great wind began to blow. The walls of Chidi's house began to shake, and the villagers, hearing the commotion, gathered outside Chidi's home, murmuring in fear and confusion. The stranger turned towards the door and spoke loudly, his voice carrying through the village.
People of Umoka, you have been deceived by this man. Every coin that has vanished from your hands, every fortune that has slipped through your fingers has found its way to this house. He has used your head, your very essence, to enrich himself.
A great murmur rose from the crowd as men recognized the truth in the spirit's words. Uche, Obina, and many others who had visited Chidi's salon shouted in anger, realizing now why they had been cursed with constant poverty despite their hard work. The village chief, an old man named Mazi, stepped forward with a grim expression. Chidi, he said, his voice heavy with disappointment, you have betrayed your people. For your greed and treachery, you will be punished. The spirit of the forest nodded.
The gods have decided all that you have taken shall be returned, and all that you have gained shall be lost.
With that, the spirit disappeared into thin air. This caused a little bit of stir in the crowd, but immediately all attention was focused back on Chidi. The villagers were shocked to hear the news, but most of them were not surprised that his wealth was ill-gotten. The villagers seized him and brought him before the elders of the village, who delivered a swift judgment. Everything Chidi owned was seized and sold, and the money redistributed back to all the men who had ever walked into his salon. Amaka, his wife, was gutted to hear the news about her husband. She dropped to the ground as she bowed her head in tears. Chidi was banished from Umoka forever. He was sent into the forest with nothing but the clothes on his back to live as an outcast, his name forever cursed. The tale of Chidi, the barber, teaches us that greed is a fire that consumes. In the pursuit of riches, Chidi lost his honor, his home, and his people. Amaka also lost her home as well due to the lure of wealth. And so, in the village of Umoka, the story of Chidi was told for generations, a reminder that wealth gained through deceit is no wealth at all. True prosperity comes from honest hard work, and the greatest riches are found not in gold or silver, but in the trust and respect of one's people. Thanks so much for watching. Please leave a comment about what you learned from this story. Also, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe till I bring to you another enchanting African tale. This is the African Storyteller.